before the revolution. He was brought up there, and he became a writer, one of the leading intellectuals of the time, in the post-war, the post-Civil War period. He was involved in so-called oppositionist politics, was rather close to Trotsky. So when the purges began, people were being expelled from the party and sent into exile or to labor camps or whatnot. He was one of them sent along. Many intellectuals were included in the purges. Since he was not a Russian citizen, but a French citizen, his case was called to the attention of intellectuals on the left in the Western world, most particularly in France, and a movement was started to get him freed from the labor camp he was in Siberia. This movement was headed by André Gide, Romain Rolland, and several others, because Russia at that time was trying to placate sympathetic intellectuals elsewhere in the world. Stalin did something almost unheard of. He allowed Serge to be released from labor camp and even to leave the country. Serge spent the rest of his life in Western Europe and finally in Mexico and died there. Now Serge was, I think, essentially a mediocre writer, very sincere, very earnest, thoroughly honest, even to the point of risking the kind of incarceration he had in Russia. But there came a moment in his life, shortly before he died, when he mobilized all of his forces and wrote what is close to a superb novel. And that is the one I've asked you to add to the list, The Case of Comrade Tulayev. This novel, I think, is in many ways a proletarian novel, although you'll find no parallel to it in any other literature in the world, because it comes out of the Russian experience, right up to and including labor camp incarceration. What he tried to do, and I think sometimes with magnificent success, was to recreate the whole insane spirit of the mass purges in Russia of the 1930s, which resulted in the deaths of quite a few millions of people, and in which he had first-hand experience. This is a strange case in which a man trying to arrive at the essence of an experience in reality produces a work of surrealism because the experience itself is surreal. I think this book puts to shame all of the exercises in literary surrealism of people who have not been subjected to the most insane pressures of our world and have the luxury of middle-class contemplation of marvels and impossibilities rather than the experience of them in the nervous system. But you see, this book is centered upon the experience of an ordinary worker, a young man, 19, 20 years old, who, in a moment of blankness, mindlessness, considering himself a perfectly devoted communist, is in the Young Communist League, is working in the young labor troops, helping to build the Moscow subway, feeling some kind of vague discontent and not knowing what it is, just decides to go into the black market and buy himself a gun, not knowing what he's going to do with the gun. And now, without having any thought in mind, he proceeds to follow a bureaucrat, a top executive in the party and the government, who is particularly responsible for laying down policy regarding youth movements, youth shock troops, labor troops, and so on, and who is thoroughly disliked by the young people, even the most ardently devoted communists. He begins to follow this man. He follows him to the luxurious apartment house in which he keeps a mistress. He's driven there in a limousine by a chauffeur, the kind of car that only a top bureaucrat has. Following this bureaucrat, seeing him step out of his limousine, about to visit his mistress, the young man takes out his gun and kills him. He has had no thought in mind as to what he's going to do. He kills him. Now, this parallels something that happened in real life in 1934 in Leningrad. It was the assassination of a top party bureaucrat, the leader, the head of the Communist Party of Leningrad, named Kirov. Apparently a mad, disoriented young man jumped up in party headquarters one day in 1934 and shot Kirov to death. This was the opening shot of what became a 5 or 6 year purge throughout the nation of the party, of the government apparatus, of industrial bureaucracy, and so on. reaching many millions of people. Now, in later years, it has emerged that the shooting of Kirov was not an accident. Rather, it was very carefully arranged by the GPU under Stalin's guidance to give him an excuse to accuse oppositionists of terrorism and therefore to initiate this massive purge. This book, Victor Serge's book, begins with that kind of random shot, that kind of random killing, and then follows the incredible proliferating process whereby a whole society is thrown into convulsion, always keeping in the center of attention the young man who, without thinking about it, fired that bullet. It is a completely surreal work of art, based, as no other exercise in surrealism are, on absolute reality. I know of no more eloquent summary of the terror atmosphere in Russia in the 1930s. Ira Wolford's Tucker's People falls a little bit outside of our category in chronological sense because it was published only in 1943. However, I think it's important enough so that I urge every one of you to examine it if you can get a hold of a copy. My reasoning is this. I think this is a thoroughly proletarian novel. It has to do with the very elaborate organization of the numbers racket in Harlem in the 1930s. And it is looking at any number of bottom dogs who are involved in a racketeering operation. I venture to make a prediction. Out of the 1930s, really, there's only one book which has survived and been reclaimed because of literary merit. And as you know, it's Call It Sleep. Henry Roth's Call It Sleep. I think that something like that is going to happen to Ira Wolford's novel in the next few years. I think it's that special. I think it's going to be discovered, rediscovered. What distinguishes it in proletarian literature is that there's an incredible grasp of the subtleties of character, of personality, and of interactions between people. The characterizations are as richly drawn as they are in a Russian novel. I think he's very much influenced by the Russian novelists. So that while he is looking at a social political mechanism, a very elaborately organized racketeering situation on the one hand, the mobilization of the police and the whole bureaucracy of the city officialdom on the other, his eye is steadily on the nuances of personality. And this is one, I think, of the potentials of a proletarian novel which has been almost totally neglected in the actual writing of these novels. I think, again, Ira Wolford's book is a valuable checkpoint for us. Finally, I did not mention in our discussion the last item under reference works, namely Eric and Mary Josephson's Man Alone, Alienation in Modern Society. There you will find some very thoroughgoing discussions of the alienation of the worker in capitalist society. So I think as background, very important for us. Well, so finally, we come to politics. We will discuss politics today and most likely at our next meeting as well. I can think of no better way to begin than with the Angela Davis case. I'll tell you very simply, I absolutely, without reservation, support all moves to keep Angela Davis on this campus. I think it's vitally necessary that she be here. And I'm prepared to take as near an ultimate stand as anybody on this campus for her right to be here. I want to add that nobody around here could disagree more totally with her politics than I do. We had a discussion in the English department during that moratorium day of some 3 hours in which this matter was discussed in some detail, and a point I tried to make there is one I'm going to try to make here. Namely, that I consider the party that Angela Davis has joined to be not simply a stand-pat status quo party, not simply a conservative party, but a reactionary party. So I want to make it clear that when I discuss the Communist Party, it's from a point of view some light years to the left of it. Now, Let's start first with Angela Davis's insistence that she not only has the right but the obligation to introduce politics into her classroom. I think absolutely this is the case. Consider that first she was hired as a Marxist philosopher. What is a Marxist philosopher? A philosopher who differs from all other philosophers in that his or her entire system of thought, entire body of concepts, is developed from Marxist principles. Now, how conceivably can a Marxist philosopher hired as such come into a classroom and pretend that Marxism doesn't exist? But Marxism is a body of political thought as well as a body of philosophical thought. So, I have no question. I don't question her stand there whatsoever. I would add that I think it's still more justified, still more necessary to introduce politics into our classroom situation, because we are dealing with an unparalleled phenomenon. A literature, a massive literature generated by a politics. Now, I think it's fair to say that this has never happened before in literary history. It's true, for example, that in the 19th century, the highly political matter of the institution of slavery in this country agitated many literary minds, and there are reflections of this agitation in what they wrote. But you know, if you examine the literature of the 19th century as a whole in this country, you find that by and large, the problem of slavery was bypassed. By and large, the intellectuals of that time were cowardly. By and large, they chose to ignore the most burning dilemma of their society, although they had to live with it and experience it daily. There was not a massive literature, particularly not a massive fiction, generated by the political turmoils and agonies that developed from the institution of slavery. Now, I may be wrong. I may have overlooked something. If you can think of another body of literature of truly massive proportions that came out of a politics, tell me. I can't. So I think that we are dealing with something that has no precedence in history. We're dealing with a body of novels, almost 100 in number, that not only came out in the 1930s, but represented the almost obsessive thought of a whole generation of intellectuals of that time. It is true that not all intellectuals were involved, whether centrally or peripherally, in the communist politics of 1930s. But those who were not were almost exceptions to the rule. There was one body of people who remained completely apart from the literature that developed in conjunction with communist politics. These were called the Southern Agrarians. And you may know some of their names: John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren, Cleanth Brooks, and several others. They had a wistful recollection of what the balmy, undisturbed days of the South were like, and they thought that the way out of the social dilemmas of the 1930s was to return that to that hierarchical, aristocratic order of things. So, of course, they would have nothing to do with communist politics. But aside from them, and they did not bulk very large on the literary scene in the 30s, more of them were critics than were creative writers. Aside from them, there was hardly a writer in this country who was not touched in one way or another by the politics we're talking about. Ernest Hemingway was not only deeply involved for a time with the literary fronts that the communist movement developed, but some of his work of that period was generated by that involvement. He would not have written his attempt at a proletarian novel, namely To Have and Have Not, if it had not been for the politics at that time. Nor possibly would he have conceived of his Spanish Civil War novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And in Spain, he was not only thoroughly involved with, he was thoroughly dominated by the completely totalitarian politics of the Communist International. The least political writer of that generation possibly was Fitzgerald. And yet, people who are close to Fitzgerald know that there came a moment when he was trying to decide how to end the book, This Side of Paradise. And for quite some days agonized over the possibility of giving it a proletarian ending. If you're familiar with the book, you know that it deals with a young, remarkably attractive, remarkably intelligent American psychiatrist and analyst deriving from the Freud school in the 20s, living a very gay, early jet-set existence in the south of France, but also pursuing his psychiatric work with obviously a brilliant career ahead of him. And he has married the ex-schizophrenic patient of his mentor in Switzerland. With this, of course, is a not too rough parallel derived from Fitzgerald's own life. The girl's apparently recovered. He has helped to bring about her recovery. And now he's married to her. And now we see moments in which he collapses again. And the essential logic is that as she derives strength from him and grows healthier, his strength is accordingly dissipated. And so at the end, the relationship of emotional forces is changed. She is the embodiment of health and vigor and commitment to life, and he is drained and hopeless. Well, as the book does end, she goes off with somebody else, one of the guys who is in their circle. He, now that depression has come about, the end of the gay 20s is here, he returns to this country and tries to establish a medical practice in a small town in upstate New York, and the indications are that he is a hopeless alcoholic, which was sort of a forerunner of what happened to Fitzgerald himself at the end of his life. Now, that was not the ending that he thought about first. He was so much influenced, though he was entirely apolitical, he was so much influenced by the political climate of his time and by what other writers he was associated with were doing, that he thought for quite a while of making Dick Diver not a hopeless alcoholic in a small town in upstate New York, but of making him a revolutionary. I think that ending would have been somewhat more interesting than the other. We'll never know. So, not only was this a massive literature, but it was practically the literature of the period we're talking about. And as I say, we know of no other such event in literary history. Now, since this literature was generated by a politics, we'd better understand what the politics was. And it was an extraordinarily complicated politics. We're not going to arrive at an understanding of the subtle maneuverings of communist policy in the 1930s until we have, in the briefest possible way, a perspective on the communist movement as a whole. I can't do very much with the 19th century except establish that it was there. But of course, you know, I'm sure all of you, that the roots of the communist movement are deep in the 19th century. That Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed from an already rich tradition of socialist thought, which was, until the time they arrived on the scene, utopian, visionary, theologically inspired, and that it was their claim that they took the essence of socialist idealism and turned it into a scientific program. You know, I'm sure, that the end programmatic announcement of the whole idea of communism was made in the Communist Manifesto, published, I would say, absolutely incredibly, in the year 1948, almost day and date with the appearance of Darwin's Origin of the Species. You can see the organic connection between these two works because, quite obviously, scientific communism as developed by Marx and Engels is a kind of social evolutionism, as Darwin's theory was a species evolutionism. I think it's absolutely vital that we make the point, too, that Marxism represented the very height of humanistic thinking in the 19th century. We tend to lose sight of this because the movements in the 20th century that claim to derive from Marx are, for the better part, anti-humanist, sneer at humanism as a bourgeois value. If Marx were around, he would put quick end to that kind of discussion. And I believe thoroughly that if Marx and Engels were around, they would recoil in horror at what has developed in social orders in this world in the name of Marxism. This movement was so humanist, the early Marxist movement, that it took an active interest in the problem of slavery in the United States. And Marx and Engels were radically and vitally concerned with that problem and urged upon organized workers in Europe that they support every movement in the United States toward an end of slavery. And therefore they took a stand on the Civil War in this country. They were involved in many such humanistic concerns. Now you know further that some organizational developments came from Marxist principles. But Marx and Engels had as their basic orientation the idea that all philosophy up to the time that they began to operate, and including most vitally Hegel, because they derived directly from Hegel, all philosophy was concerned up to that point only with understanding the world. And this made philosophy impotent and distorted the nature of thought. Because, as they put it, the problem is not to understand the world, but to change it. And they said further that only in the process of an active intervention into the historical developments, only in that process can the philosopher truly understand reality. He cannot understand it at a distance and in passivity. So that involvement in the events of your day, in an effort to shape them and change them, is necessary to become a true philosopher with a true grasp of reality. In that spirit, they undertook to organize communist parties in various parts of the world, primarily in Western Europe. And these parties came together with various other kinds of labor groupings, particularly union movements here and there, and formed what was called the First International. The First International, after some years, foundered and ultimately fragmented because of waves of political reaction and repression which swept across Europe. Then came an attempt to revive this international movement dedicated to communist liberation of the working class in the form of the Second International. And here is where our story truly begins. Second International had national divisions in most of the developed countries of the world, most particularly in Western Europe. But there was even a small branch formed in the United States. Now there was a branch also in Russia. Something very particular happened to that branch, that Russian branch of the Second International. A crucial event in the year 1903. There was a conference, a national gathering, a congress, if you will, of the leaders of that Russian movement. And now very centrally involved were Lenin and Lenin's associates and Trotsky. Trotsky was at that time 24 years old. Lenin several years older. A contest developed in that Congress over a principle developed by Lenin, which he called democratic centralism. It had to do with it was an organizational principle. He was saying that the Second International and all of its branches were too flabby were devoted to endless discussions which robbed them of the capacity of action and which allowed for totally incompatible views to exist side by side. He was saying some kind of discipline, some kind of centrality was necessary if such a party were to be a true spear-pointed organization for social change, a true political force. The idea of democratic centralism was that if an issue came up in your party, you had a thorough discussion along lines allowed for by your constitution. Then you had a vote. Once the vote was taken, everybody had to abide by that decision. No further discussion. So that the democracy was in the discussion, the centralism was in the absolute discipline once a vote was taken. Now that on the face of it seems like a perfectly natural and logical procedure. You would say that any organization you belong to, political, social, or whatever, is guided roughly by such principles. But there were hidden issues involved here. There was a split between the people who supported Lenin and the people who were leery of the idea of democratic centralism. A vote was taken. The majority people came to be known as Bolsheviks. The word Bolshevik means simply majority. The minority people came to be known as Mensheviks. The word Menshevik means simply minority. But what political implications developed from this apparently simple, organizational, non-principled discussion? First of all, Trotsky, who was on the extreme revolutionary side of things as regarded political program, was further left at that time than Lenin and his associates were. At the same time, recoiled with utter revulsion from Lenin's idea of democratic centralism. And at age 24, he sat down, he wrote a most remarkable book, savagely attacking this idea and predicting that if the principle of democratic centralism prevailed in working class politics, this sequence of events would inevitably follow. First, that for the working class as a whole, the party would be substituted. For the party as a whole, the central committee of the party would be substituted. For the central committee of the party, the plenum, or the permanently operating portion of the central committee would be substituted. For the plenum, ultimately, one man would be substituted. And if power had been seized somewhere along the line, what would result would be a social structure that would be essentially a one-man dictatorship with an ironclad bureaucracy under it. This was written in 1904. And I think any of you who are not absolutely dedicated to the official politics of the official communist movement will see that this was in word for word an exact prediction of what happened in Russia following 1920. Trotsky, however, was appalled by the politics of the Mensheviks, although he seemed to be united with them in attacking Lenin organizationally. And so he stood apart from both groups from 1903 to 1917. In the interim, became a flaming leader, perhaps the best known leader at that time in Russia, because you may know that for a short time a Soviet was established in 1905 in Petrograd, and Trotsky was the leader of that at age 26. Well, then there came years of exile. All of these people were rounded up, and they were from all the tendencies, and they were thrown into jails and into exile in Siberia, and many of them escaped, as did Trotsky. They all made their way to Western Europe, and they formed exile groups in Vienna, to a certain extent in Paris, and in London. And they were stood in disarray until 1917, when Russia, staggering under one military defeat after another in the World War I, underwent political convulsions and the Tsarist regime was overthrown in the first of the Russian revolutions of February 1917, led essentially by Mensheviks. And now there came a period of great agitation between February and October of 1917. Since the Tsarist regime had been overthrown and the worst political repression had been smashed, those revolutionary leaders in exile could come back to Russia, and they did. Many Mensheviks in exile came back, and all the Bolshevik leaders did. And so did Trotsky, who had been for a period of time in New York. Let me add that by this time, the issues between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks had achieved staggering dimensions, primarily having to do with attitude toward the war. You see, in what a subtle way there was a crystallization, a polarization of political forces over what seemed to be a minor organizational issue. The polarization of forces had to do with a careful separation of reformists from revolutionaries and of nationalists from internationalists. The Second International, which continued to exist after the Bolsheviks split away in Russia in 1917, was convulsed by the beginning of the war in 1914. They considered themselves socialists, and yet they were faced with a harrowing problem in each of their countries. What was a German socialist to do when the war began? Support his own government, fight against French workers, British workers, and so on? Or remain an internationalist and declare for international solidarity of all workers against all capitalist systems? Most of the socialist parties of the world in the Second International became nationalist parties and patriotic parties supporting their own governments in the war effort. And so, their official policy was, in each country, to support their own government, to join the army, to fight in the army against workers in other armies opposing them. Now, the Bolsheviks remained internationalists. They refused to become what was called at the time social patriots in any country, any capitalist country. Their policy was very clear-cut. It was for the military defeat of any country you happened to be in that was engaged in a war. Why did they want military defeat? Because military defeat would throw a country into disarray and make it possible for a working class organization to make a drive for power. So that the war was of interest to the internationalists, the revolutionaries, who were Bolsheviks or sympathetic to the Bolsheviks in other parts of the world, was of interest to them only as a situation in which you could throw the capitalist class into such confusion as to try to arrive at power, kick them out and take power yourself. Well, here now, assembled again in Russia in 1917, were Mensheviks, many of whom were supporting Russia in the war, supporting the efforts of the army, and Bolsheviks, who were for the defeat of Russia and for the defeat of every other country engaged in a war, and for the struggle for complete accession to power. And other parties too, social revolutionaries, anarchists of various sorts, but these were the central forces. Now came an enormous issue. The so-called democratic revolution, bourgeois democratic revolution, had been carried out in largely feudal Russia in February of 1917. A revolution which roughly corresponded to the great bourgeois democratic revolutions carried out in France in 1789, in England earlier, which ushered in the era of free capitalist enterprise and of bourgeois cultural development. According to the past historical record, once the last bonds of feudalism were thrown off and full individualistic capitalist enterprise was allowed for, a long period of capitalist development should be gone through, 100, 150 years. And by classic Marxist analysis, only then, when the capitalist forces of production were highly developed, the country was thoroughly industrialized, and the class struggle was completely crystallized between a massive working class that was handling the means of production, and a capitalist class which owned and controlled and operated the means of production. Only then would the next great social revolution, namely the socialist or communist one, be possible. Now the Bolsheviks thoroughly disagreed with this approach in Russia. They said, and Trotsky in particular said, he took the most radical position of all. He said, it is too late in the day to carry out a democratic bourgeois revolution and then allow for a long period of historical development in which the bourgeoisie fulfill its historical role and then wait 100 years possibly or more until history declared the field open for socialist politics from the working class. He said no, because of the international situation, the bourgeois democratic revolution could no longer fulfill itself. A backward country could not proceed at a leisurely pace to develop its industry. In this day, according to the law of combined development, which he proposed, the bourgeois democratic revolution will prove to be cowardly, totally inadequate, will sell out to strong foreign powers, the advanced capitalist nations of the West, will never allow a flourishing of democratic rights, individualism in a true sense. And so, if this late in the day a bourgeois democratic revolution does take place, as it took place in February of 1917 in Russia, it could be fulfilled only if it was turned immediately into a proletarian socialist revolution. And so Trotsky's program was to initiate immediately a struggle to convert the bourgeois democratic revolution into a socialist one. He finally, in July of 1917, sold this idea to Lenin and his associates, the old Bolsheviks, who were wavering. They thought that very possibly it would take a long time before you could present a bold socialist program. Trotsky convinced them, brought them over to his side as to the immediacy, the urgency of the struggle for power on the part of the working class. Now they made a deal, as Trotsky said later. He convinced them, the Leninists, the Bolshevik Leninists, politically, they convinced him organizationally. In other words, finally, after 12 or 13 years of thorough opposition to the idea of democratic centralism, Trotsky came around to Lenin's point of view and accepted it. He put this in the nature of a trade. He thought that the political issue was more important than the organizational. If they accepted his politics, he would accept their organizational procedures. And it was that at that moment, in July of 1917, that Trotsky joined the Communist Party. We now have come to the point at which the Bolsheviks took power, indeed converted the bourgeois revolution into a socialist one in October of 1917. And let us leave it there for the moment, and we'll continue next.